This just went flying off. I don't know what that's. Sorry about that. Okay, I'd like to welcome back those of you who were here last night, and welcome to those of you here for the second lecture. And I can promise you, you're in for a real treat. I want to give a very brief reintroduction to Stan Dehaene for the second lecture. And I thought what I would do is just quote from some of the spontaneously offered comments that I got over the last 24 hours. What a great start. Awesome. Terrific. Gorgeous work. And my favorite, in part because it echoes commercials for the basketball star Michael Jordan. I want to be just like Stan. Last night, Stan treated us to a discussion about how the mind and brain sciences can inform one of the hardest sort of nuts, which is culture, and specifically how we evolved a capacity to read by recycling bits of neural hardware that had evolved originally for a different function. And tonight, Stan will travel where few men have dared to travel before, taking us literally on a Star Trekian journey into space, time, and number. And believe me, he's way better than Captain Kirk. And so the format for tonight is going to be very much like the format for last night, which is that Stan will speak for approximately 50 minutes or so, and then we have two discussants to follow, Lisa Randall from the Department of Physics and Peter Galison from the Department of History, Science, and Physics, who each offer some brief remarks, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So please join me in welcoming Stan Dehaene.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Yesterday I told you some speculations about the origins of reading, and today I'm going to be even bolder and try to tell you about the possible origins of some mathematics concepts. I call the lecture Space, Time, and Number mostly because these are my initials, Stan. But in fact, I won't have time today. I won't have time for time, but I will talk mostly about number and a little bit about space. Also, I think this work is much less advanced. Of course, it's an enormous stretch and almost an impossible challenge to say anything about the origins of higher-level mathematics concepts. And to show you how much a stretch this is, I would like to start by introducing you to two mathematicians. The first one is a very romantic character of mathematics. I show you a page from his notebook yesterday, Srinivasa Ramanujan, who basically, alone with the help of a few books in India, recreated much of mathematics and created mathematics of his own that mathematicians today are still challenged by his beautiful formulas. We would like to understand, of course, ultimately how the human mind can produce objects as complicated as these, but my talk will be in fact much closer to another mathematician, a much more primitive one, I'm afraid, Otto Köhler-Sparrott, who is behaving in a numerical way here. He's picking up the number of objects on this plate and has been trained to select the same number, and you can see that he goes to the plate with the same number, he has 7 dots. This was some of the earliest work in Germany that was showing that animals can have numerical abilities. And what I'm going to claim is that although there is a chasm between these two mathematicians, in a certain sense, we find the origins or the foundations of our ability to do mathematics in this type of talent. The basic abilities to extract information about number, information about space, and to construct upon these representations higher cultural constructions. Of course, I don't want to skip the difficulties of this enterprise of trying to build a story on the foundations of mathematics. There's a lot of disagreement about the nature of mathematics. Maybe that's why the angel is so sad here in the Melancholia painting of Dürer, because he's looking at these mathematical objects and he doesn't know whether these are mathematics in general, a corpus of absolute truth independent of the human mind, which is mostly, I would say, what a majority of practicing mathematicians think. This is nicely summarized by Hardy in his quote. I believe that mathematical reality lies outside of us, that our function is to discover or observe it, and that the theorems which we prove and which we describe grandiloquently as our creations are simply our notes of our observations. That's one view, but there is another view which is closer to the biological thinking, and which is that mathematics is a creation of the human brain. This is stated very squarely by Jean-Pierre Changeux in his discussion with the French mathematician Alain Cohn. Mathematical objects correspond to physical states of our brain. Of course, I'm going to defend the second position, but we should not skip the big challenges which have led, in fact, many mathematicians to the first position. And there are at least two major problems that we should try to have an answer to. The first is the problem of the so-called absolute truth in mathematics. So as Bertrand Russell stated, mathematics takes us into the region of absolute necessity, to which not only the actual world, but every possible world, sorry for the spelling, must conform. And really this is, I think, a major challenge, how we can imagine that a finite, fallible human brain, a biological object, basically comes to know some absolute mathematical truth, agreed upon by all and seemingly waiting for their discovery since all eternity. How, for instance, can we have a concept of infinity where we have a finite brain? I think remains an extraordinary gap in our knowledge of cognitive science. And to illustrate this difficulty, we can look for cross-cultural convergence in mathematics, which is very frequent, where different mathematicians, unrelated, discover the same seeming truth. So, for instance, the structure of the Pascal triangle here in China and Europe. There is a second problem, which is the so-called problem of the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. How is it possible that mathematics, which is a product of human thought, that is independent of experience, so says Einstein, fits so excellently the objects of physical reality? And again, this is a nice illustration here, because the bottom line of the Pascal triangle converges to this curve, Gaussian curve, which is an excellent description of Brownian motion, for instance. So how is it possible that objects that are designed for something completely different describe physical reality so well? I have immediately to say that I'm not a philosopher, and I will not provide an answer to this question. I will just point to a direction in which we might begin to find that perhaps there is a solution. And from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, what I would like to say is that during its evolution, our primate brain has been endowed with elementary representations that are adequate to certain aspects of the external world. These include internalized representation of space, time, and number, which are in fact shared by many animal species, like the parrot you saw at the beginning. And my claim is that these provide the foundations of mathematics. This is where we should look for the solution to this very complicated problem of the foundations of mathematics, where it eventually stops. Now, of course, this creates yet another problem, which is why we are the only species capable of mathematics. I'm going to touch upon that problem in the third lecture tomorrow, but today I will mention several aspects of this problem. I believe that humans may have a special ability, unique ability to mobilize in a top-down manner and to reconnect in novel ways their evolutionary ancient brain processes. And tomorrow I'm going to talk about this workspace system that may be involved in putting together these different pieces. So we may have the same basic representation of processes as other animal species, but we put them together, we can play with them in novel ways. And today what will be important is that in the case of number representations, we have symbols for numbers, such as Arabic numerals that are cultural creations, and we are able to attach these arbitrary shapes to quantities to other non-verbal concepts as well, such as the concept of geometry, for instance. And I will show you that this changes, to a large extent, our way to conceptualize number. There is another aspect, which is that disparate mathematical concepts, or we might call them proto-mathematical concepts of space and of number, can be attached together in novel ways. And I would like to argue that metaphors, such as, for instance, the metaphor that number is like a space, or that space can be labeled with numbers, has led to an extraordinary progress in mathematics, such as, for instance, Cartesian coordinates, measurements, complex plane, and so on and so forth. So, from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, how could we point to a possible solution of the problem of absolute truth? Well, I would claim that perhaps it is the case that because we start with the same foundations and we have the same cognitive apparatus, the ultimate products of our mathematics are so tightly constrained by this pre-existing structure of our mental representations that they might appear to us as a rigid body of absolute truth. we should not forget, and I think Platonist mathematicians all too often forget, that their cultural construction is fuzzy and chaotic. This was stated here. Mathematics is not a careful march down a well-cleared highway, but a journey into a strange wilderness, where the explorers often get lost. And rigor should be a signal to the historian that the maps have been made and the real explorers have gone elsewhere. And in particular, the French mathematician Poincaré, not all mathematicians are Platonists, and the French mathematician Poincaré stressed how much intuition plays a role in the invention of mathematics. And in Peter Galison's book here in Harvard, I found this beautiful quote: even though pure mathematics could do without it, it is always necessary to come back to intuition, to bridge the abyss that separates symbol from reality. I think this is exactly what we are going to see today, that we have intuitions and that symbols bridge onto these intuitions. How about unreasonable effectiveness? That's a real difficult problem. I think it clearly points to something that nobody can explain, which is that there are structures outside in the environment and that our minds are able to grasp some of these structures in the outside world. But I think we should also not forget that mathematicians constantly create new mathematical objects which are not adapted to the external physical world. And when these objects are not adapted, we call them pure mathematics. Some are adapted, and of course, then there is a problem of their unreasonable effectiveness. We might find an explanation, first of all, in the fact that these basic foundational representations are adapted themselves because they have been found useful in evolution. And I think the sense of number is a very clear case in which it's advantageous for an animal species to possess this number sense. Second, there is another evolution which takes place at the scale of cultures, at the scale of the life of a single mathematician, and this is that mathematicians and physicists continue to select these objects for their explanatory adequacy. And so there might be nothing mysterious, as some have tried to maintain, about the applicability of mathematics. What we get by abstraction from something can be returned. These are just directions. I won't go any longer into philosophy, which is not my field, but I want to show you more concretely now what could be these foundational objects of mathematics. For me, cognitive studies in the domain of numbers started with this beautiful finding by Moyer and Landauer in 1967, when they asked subjects to compare two numbers, and they measured the reaction time that it took them to decide that a number was larger than another. And what they found was that the response time was not determined by visual similarity or by the symbols, it was determined by conceptual similarity at the level of the quantities themselves. So the subjects were much slower when the digits were close. So here you have to compare to 65. You can see that the reaction time gets remarkably slower by an enormous amount as the numbers that you have to compare get closer to the reference. This suggests that subjects are not sticking with the symbols, but they are using as a basis for their decision a much deeper representation, which takes into account the semantic similarity between numbers. And we pursued this effect with functional imaging with Philippe Pinel, and we found that there are areas of the left and right parietal lobes that show a beautiful parallel in their amount of activation to this semantic distance effect. But in fact, this left and right parietal region, this is a slice through the brain, and you can see here the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. You see that there are two regions here, left and right, that seem to be systematically activated in many different tasks that involve number processing, and particularly when you are thinking about the quantities involved in a calculation. Essentially, all numerical tasks activate this region, even when you just have to detect a digit, for instance. And several studies have shown that two criteria are fulfilled to suggest that this might be involved at the semantic level of representation. First, this region will respond to various formats of presentation of numbers, including symbolic, Arabic numerals, for instance, and non-symbolic, such as sets of objects. The second is that it varies according to a semantic metric. I just showed you this distance effect, but also the size of the numbers involved will determine the complexity of some calculations and make the activation vary in this area. Further suggestion that this area is important for number processing comes from lesion experiments. Some patients suffer from strokes in the parietal cortex, and very often with left parietal lesions, they develop what is called acalculia, an inability to perform calculations, when in some of the worst cases turns out to be a deeper inability to understand I studied some patients whose deficit was so severe that they could no longer compute 7 minus 5, or 6 plus 6, and that they had difficulty in deciding which number fell between 2 and 4, for instance. So suggesting that this intuition of what it is about number that makes it a reference to a quantity might be specifically impaired. Importantly, such deficits also seem to occur in children, and this is very much work in progress, but in the recent years, it has been found that dyscalculia, specifically a specific impairment in the ability to acquire knowledge of numbers in the school years, has been related in a number of different pathologies to anomalies of either the left or the right parietal regions in both their anatomy, the density of gray matter, and in their functional levels of activation. Either in this case in premature children, many of whom develop the difficulty with mathematics and calculation, or here in this genetic syndrome called Turner syndrome. So there is a suggestion that if this representation is disorganized, if this particular brain area is disorganized, you may have lifelong difficulties in understanding the concepts of numbers and the related operations. Now, of course, this does not tell us whether there is evolutionary history behind this representation, behind this particular activation. In order to try to make a relation to the monkey brain and to see whether there might be in the monkey brain a similar representation, with my colleague Olivier Simon, we use brain imaging in humans to try to make a map not just of the activations occurring during simple calculation, but also of the neighboring areas, which we knew from many different papers are involved in saccades, and rather abstract system here of perhaps attention orienting involved in various visual spatial tasks, manual tasks, grasping selectively. And we chose these operations because there was already at that time a rough map of the organization of these systems in the monkey brain. And we were pleased to see that the general geometrical organization of these areas tended to be similar in the monkey brain. The notion of an exact homology is still very much debated, so I don't think this resolves this difficult problem of homology, but it was the beginning of this form of comparative imaging. This was based on single-cell data. This was based on fMRI in humans. From it, we got the suggestion that the calculation system systematically falls at a reproducible location relative to these landmarks of saccades and grasping. And if we turn now to the monkey brain, there were two possibilities. One is that this area simply does not exist in the monkey brain, and it's true that there is an enormous expansion of this area in the human brain. So it's possible that this is a novel acquisition. But there was this interesting other possibility, which is that by recording in area VIP in the middle of the intraparietal sulcus here, you might find that there are neurons that relate to number processing. And it was a fantastic pleasure to discover that in 2002, Andreas Nieder and Earl Miller did this experiment of trying to record from neuron in intraparietal cortex, and they found such neurons. What they did was to train a monkey to remember the number of objects briefly presented to them as a sample set here, like 4 objects, and after a delay to choose whether there was a match or not with the second set which was presented to them. And after the monkey had done this task and they could generalize to novel images so that we could really be sure that this was about number, they recorded first from prefrontal cortex and second from intraparietal cortex. The intraparietal cortex, very much like at the place where we would have expected it in the depths of the intraparietal sulcus, but also in prefrontal cortex, they found neurons related to number, with the interesting point that these are fastest. So these are the ones that respond fastest to the set of objects, and presumably they are the ones that extract the numerosity information. What you find is that these neurons have a tuning curve for number. So this is a plot of firing rate as a function of the number of items which is presented to the monkey during the sample, or this could be also during the delay. And you find that each neuron prefers a certain numerical value. So the neuron in the middle, for instance, fires best when there is 3 objects, and least when there is 1 object. And you can see there is a nice tuning curve. The recordings were so precise that they found there were mathematical properties that these neurons could be described mathematically, and it fitted extremely well with the model that I happen to have proposed with Jean-Pierre Changeux in 1993, which is that the underlying continuum here, the x-axis is a logarithmic axis, so you should plot the logarithm of the number, and once you do that, the tuning curves are Gaussian tuning curves. They are nicely symmetrical. The recordings was precise enough that you could test these ideas, and indeed, if you plot this data on a linear axis, the representation is more complicated and less symmetrical and so on. So basically, we have a coding scheme here which can encode number, and the work after that I did tried to show that from this coding scheme, you can reconstruct very much what we know about the psychophysics of reaction time in numerical tasks. So can we understand, for instance, how we go from seeing a set of objects to deciding whether this is larger or smaller than some reference, the comparison task I showed you at the beginning? Well, if we assume just with only one free parameter here that there is a coding by Gaussian neurons on the logarithmic continuum, and there is a certain width to these Gaussians, which determines the precision of the coding scheme. If we then try to derive what would be the best way to take decisions, we see that for larger, smaller comparison, we would have to fix a criterion. We would pool the units favoring the hypothesis that the number is smaller than the reference, and the units favoring the idea that it's larger than the reference. This is standard psychophysics. Then we might make the difference of these two pool of units, compute the difference in firing rates. This would give us an idea of the log likelihood ratio. I'm sparing the details. And if we accumulate this information as the spikes come at random times, but they can be accumulated, we would get a kind of random walk which would eventually accumulate enough information that we would have relative certainty for one response as opposed to the other. And if we suppose that the subject responds when this random walk hits a certain level here, we have a model for how subjects compare to numbers. It's a model that will be familiar to many of you. I will explain the history of this model a little bit more tomorrow, but many people, including Lamming, Radcliffe, Stephen Link, have contributed to this type of model. What is nice is to see that it fits extremely well the data if you start with this assumption of a logarithmic Gaussian coding. So this is data from the monkey, which was kindly provided to me by Kentlon and Brannon. The monkey is comparing two sets of objects and deciding which one is the largest in number. You can see this is the reaction time of the subject with this distance effect I was showing you. This is the error rate of the subject. And this is plotted as a function of the relevant variable, which according to the model should be the log of the ratio of the two numbers. You can see that we get relatively good fits for reaction time and error rates. We have an answer to something that always puzzled me. Why are these two curves so different? This one is clearly more peaky than the reaction time curve, and now the model explains that. It's in the mathematics. There is a relation between RTs and errors, which can be explained. This was nicely pointed out already by Stephen Link. And we can get to a hidden quantity, which is basically the amount of information which is accumulated per unit of time by the system to take its numerical decision. And you can see that for different numbers, as predicted by the model, the amount of information accumulated per unit of time is exactly a linear function of the difference in the logarithm of the two numbers. So I don't think this is a definitive model. It's a pretty good model now. It really looks like psychophysics for a domain which is relatively abstract like number. However, can we show even further that maybe there are number neurons in a human brain? Because there is a step here. We are assuming that the monkey brain has the same organization as the human brain. It's, of course, impossible at the moment with brain imaging to look at single neurons, and although there have been just a few reports of single neuron recordings in humans in this area that suggest that we may be on the right track, we have to use imaging to look at this in normal human subjects. We try to use the following trick in imaging, because of course we cannot see single neurons. We only see voxels that contain maybe close to 1 million neurons or more. The trick is called adaptation. Many of you will be familiar with this. The idea is that we can repeatedly present a certain quantity of dots, which are 16, 16, 16, and the neurons, the neural population that codes for this particular quantity will adapt. It will fire less and less. And after adaptation, we may then present other sets. And we can see if we present 16 again, probably we should get a low level of activation. We should see if by presenting novel numbers, we get a recovery of the adaptation. And if we get a recovery, this should be able to trace the kind of tuning curve of the neurons, because it will tell us which neurons respond to this novel quantity that did not respond before to this old quantity. I think you get the idea, and this is exactly what we found. We were scanning the whole brain, but in this experiment done by Manuela Piazza, the only two regions that came out were the left and the right intraparietal sulci in this test for a response to a change of number, and the amount of activation traced rather nicely an inverse Gaussian, which we take to mean that there is also Gaussian tuning neurons in the human brain. We could show, for instance, that if you double the number, you just slide this curve along on the log number line. So basically, the width of this curve is proportional to the size of the number, which is an indication of Weber's law. So the suggestion is that the human brain, just like the brain of other primates, contains number neurons. But can we say something about their origins? Here we are scanning adults. In fact, the experiment was replicated and improved by Cantlon and Brannon in a recent paper in PLOS. The first improvement that they introduced, and they did that first in adults, was to contrast nicely titrated changes in number and changes in shape, which were equally difficult for the subjects to detect. And they could show that this reveals a dorsal-ventral distinction with the left and right parietal regions responding to the change in number, and the left ventral occipitotemporal region responding to a change in shape, as we might expect from its sensitivity to shape, as I showed yesterday. So this is a nice experiment because the difficulty is the same, and you can show that it's not just a generic response to any kind of change, which triggers these responses here. They then went on to test 4-year-olds and find that a similar organization is already present. Data was a little bit more messy, but they were able to find that in the right parietal cortex, there was already a response to number change, and there was also a response in occipitotemporal cortex to changes in shape. So this ventral dorsal organization is already present in 4 years old. With Véronique Izard and Ghislaine Dehaene-Lambert, we try to see if even at an earlier age there might already be a response to number change. Now the technique here is not fMRI, it is a little bit more rustic. It involves placing electrodes on the surface of the head, and we have these electrode nates that allow us to put 64 electrodes on the baby's heads. But the idea, the logic was very much the same. What Véronique did was to present repeatedly sets of, in this example, 4 objects, and occasionally there would be deviants. This is a deviant. You see there were 8 objects. The deviants could change either in shape or in number or in both parameters at once, allowing us to look at these 2 different effects of changes in number and changes in shape. The issue is whether there is a novelty reaction that we can pick up with these electrodes and perhaps relate to some brain regions. And the results indeed suggested that number change and object change already trigger different systems in the baby brain. Both occur at about the same time. They start around 400 milliseconds here, and they develop in a fairly extensive way in time, with a peak around 800 milliseconds at which these snapshots are taken. You can see that the topography of these 2 effects of number change and object change tended to be very different. And in both cases, there was a response whether we change from 2 to 3, 4 to 8, or 4 versus 12 for number. And there was a response to shape change within almost all of these groups. Of course, when the numbers get large, the objects get smaller. So maybe that's why we get a smaller effect of shape change here, because they're more difficult to see these little shapes when there is a large number. But basically, evidence for 2 orthogonal systems, one that deals with number, one that deals with shape. And we try to make inferences about the relevant brain systems from ERPs, event-related potential. It's a little bit difficult because all you have is scalp recordings. But we try to use these models that project the activation on the surface of the cortex based on a model that we had from MRI of the cortical folds of a 3-month-old baby. And you can see here that number change and object change created curves that differed. Guiding you through this a little bit, it's a little bit confusing, I'm afraid, but you can see already that the left occipitotemporal region, extending all the way into anterior temporal cortex here, tended to respond to changes in the object that was presented. Whereas, interestingly, there is a right parietal response here to number change. There is no such response to object change. And this seems to occur much like in the Cantillon and Brannon paper, mostly in the right parietal cortex, suggesting that perhaps there is development of the left. There are some interesting aspects to this data. One puzzling aspect is that there seems to be an antagonistic relation between the dorsal and the ventral road. So we find here that there is an inversion of the effect, a collapse of the activation. When number changes, there's a collapse of the activation in the areas that were responding to number change before. So maybe there is an antagonistic relation, and of course in adults we learn to integrate these two pathways a little bit more, but maybe in babies they are working in a more antagonistic mode. But we think this is suggestion that this number system may be present very early on in the brain of younger babies, 3 and 4 months olds. Of course, there is a lot of behavioral evidence to suggest, coming from Elisabeth Spelke's lab and Sukere's lab, suggesting that there is an ability to discriminate these numbers behaviorally very early on. Now, I told you a lot about sets of objects. I want to move quickly to what happens when we learn symbols for these objects. As we go to school and as our parents also teach us to count, we attach at least 2 symbol systems to this quantity representation. We attach Arabic numerals and we attach words of the language. And I had suggested a long time ago that this quantity representation in the 2 hemispheres in the parietal lobes gets attached to the visual forms of number words and Arabic symbols, as well as to this verbal code somewhere in the left pericilian cortex for representing the words for number. However, at that time, it did not occur to me that maybe this process of attachment changes somehow the quantity representation. And now I think that we begin to have evidence coming from multiple directions that it's not just linking, but there is also a deep change in the underlying representations. But first, is there really attachment? And can we show that perhaps there are similar neurons in parietal cortex that code both for non-symbolic quantity, a set of 20 dots, and for symbolic quantities like the symbol, Arabic symbol 20. In order to look at this, Manuela Piazza and I did this experiment where we looked at cross-notation adaptation. So we adapt with one notation. For instance, here the subject sees Arabic symbols, 19, 17, 18, and at some point in the middle there might be a set of dots. And the set of dots might be close or far in numerosity. Later on we continue the adaptation, and at some point there may be, for instance, the Arabic numeral 50. Yeah. Okay. So we can change the quantity or not, and we can change the notation or not. In fact, we always change the quantity a little bit, but we compare trials in which the quantity is close with trials in which the quantity is far. So if you're adapted to these numbers, of course, you can notice that the symbols always change, but this is in the right ballpark. It's in the same approximate range of numbers, whereas quantity 50 here is very different. So we expected to see a response to novelty in the parietal cortex to changes in numbers when they were far, but not when they were close. And well, this is very much what we found in a nutshell in the left and right parietal regions. There was more response in this experiment. Perhaps we speculate because the distance between the numbers was so large that it was extremely noticeable for subjects, and many regions of the frontal lobes were also involved. But I focus here on the left and right parietal regions, and this is the amount of response to novelty that we get for dots among dots. This is basically a replication of the prior experiment. For Arabic digits among Arabic digits, you get also a big response, but crucially also for Arabic digits among dots. So you've been adapted to a non-symbolic quantity, then you have a strong reaction when you see a number which is not compatible, but presented as Arabic numerals. We had this effect in the left and right parietal regions, but there was a surprise. This is the fact that this bar is so low here means there is not much difference in reaction to the quantity change when we adapt to Arabic numerals and there is suddenly a set of dots. Now, why is that? We were a little bit puzzled by this situation, especially you can see that it's much stronger effect in the left parietal region. There is a little bit of novelty reaction here in the right parietal region, suggesting that something special is happening with these symbols. Well, there is a model in the literature that may help. This model has been developed by Vergutz and Fias, and it's a connectionist model. It's training a neural network to react to non-symbolic inputs, a kind of continuum of number, here number of objects. So you have 4 objects actually it's grouped by 2, so you have 4 neurons to represent the quantity 2, or you can present a sort of symbolic input that points to the quantity 2. And what they suggest is that after learning, they can simulate the tuning curves of neurons that were found by Nieder and Miller for non-symbolic inputs, but for symbolic inputs, the very same units in the model were developing extremely sharp tuning curves. And furthermore, this is a simulation of the different types of neurons that Nieder and Miller were finding, but they found that when you present a symbolic input, you can also get neurons tuned to number, but they would all have very sharp tuning curves that essentially create a linear rather than a logarithmic continuum. So I thought this is a concept that's very interesting. You could have the very same neurons coding for quantity in both symbolic and non-symbolic modality, but they do so in different ways. They have an exact representation when symbols are presented. We wonder whether there was evidence for that in our data, and so I went back to analyze a little bit more closely now that we have this mathematical model, the reaction times I showed you at the beginning, for comparison of an Arabic numeral to a reference. And interestingly, in order to fit the data the best, this is the amount of information accumulated per unit of time that the model derives from the reaction time curve for symbolic numerals. And you can immediately see it doesn't look like the line that I showed before for non-symbolic stimuli. There is a discontinuity here, and what that discontinuity means is that we have exact information about numbers. So even when they're extremely close to one another, we always accumulate positive non-zero information about the fact that one number is larger than the other. Furthermore, in order to get the best representation, we had to plot this as a function of the linear difference between the two numbers, not the logarithm. And in order to show this directly within the same subjects, we had the same subjects compare either symbolic sets of, non-symbolic sets of dots or symbolic Arabic numerals. And we did this with 2 reference, 25 or 55, and you can see the major difference in the reconstructions of the model. We get distance effects in both cases. The curves look a little bit alike, but when we analyze them in some detail, it seems that the exact information which is accumulated is not exactly the same. It seems to be a logarithmic number line in the case of dots, a linear number line with exact representations in the case of Arabic numerals. So there might be a profound transformation in the way we represent numbers when we acquire symbols. And there is evidence for such a profound transformation from a third piece of data. All of this is a little patchy for the moment. I'm really showing you extremely recent thinking about this transformation in the number domain. But one piece of data comes from Singler and Hopfer, who asked children, as well as adults, to do what we have called in the neuropsychology domain a thermometer task. The idea is you give the subjects a line, there is a label that says here goes 1, there's another label that says here goes 100, and then you give numbers, and the subjects are supposed to place these numbers on the number line. Okay. So if you're asked to place 50, maybe you'll place it in the middle. But interestingly, there is developmental change in this representation. The young ones don't use the linear representation that the older ones and adults use. So second and fourth graders seem to have a logarithmic representation as the spontaneous way of doing their task. So in order to understand this, the best is to think of where you would place the number 10. You might place it somewhere here, but the kids will place it closer to the middle, as you would do on a logarithmic number line. That's the spontaneous response before they are educated to the idea of measurement and a linear number line. So it's very interesting and suggests indeed again that there might be developmental change, that we start with a logarithmic number line similar to what animals have, similar to what we find even in our neurons, and there is a shift. And we move to a more complex representation. We don't quite understand still exactly how this process of change occurs. There is a lot of speculation and interesting experiments coming from labs here in Harvard. But it seems that the evidence for such a major change is accumulating now. Well, I'm going now to, in the last 10 minutes, to leave the number domain. I hope I've given you a little bit of indications that we can begin to have a story for the foundations of arithmetic in non-verbal representation found in animals and which we learn to transform by labeling with symbols. I I'm wondering now, oh, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting a most important aspect of my talk, so I'm not going to leave number immediately. I thought I will go later to the space domain. I want to stick one more bit of data here, which of course is very interesting and exciting on the number domain, which came from work that we were able to do in Amazonia with Liz Pelke, Véronique Izard, and Cathy Lemaire, and Pierre Picard. In order to test these ideas of a radical change in representation of number, we were lucky enough to be able to do some experiments with these people, the Munduruku, who live in Amazonia, and who have a rather restricted lexicon of number words. So you can see here that they have words for 1, they have words for 2, 3, and 4. After 4, it begins to be much more fuzzy. They have a word for 1 hand. We're not sure whether it's exactly 5 or more like a handful. We know that these numbers are used without counting and more in a labeling way to refer to approximate quantities. So you can see here that as we present a certain set of objects, this is the frequency with which they will use a given word. And so even for the word for, say, 4 here, which is in light blue, you can see that they will use this word even when there is 5 or 6 or 7 objects with a certain tuning curve once again. So we thought that maybe this is a situation in which they just have labels for this approximate representation. They have not yet developed a complete syntactically based system of numbers that can be used for counting. And the prediction would be, of course, that they should still be able to do a lot of numerical tasks, all of those that involve approximate numerical representations, but they might not be able to do tasks that rely on an exact representation of number, and they should have a logarithmic number line. And basically, this is what we found in them. So this is an example of one of the tasks that Véronique Izard designed. You are the subject now. So you see a number of dots falling into this box, which was empty at the beginning. There is another set of dots. You won't have time to count. And then there is a third set of dots. And you ask, is there more dots inside the box as a total than in this set here? We can do psychophysics with this task, and of course, as the difference between the two numbers gets larger, the subjects get better, so performance increases here. But you can see that the performance of the Munduruku subjects, including young children, is just about the same as that of the French subjects we could test. So they were excellent at that task, even though the numbers involved were way beyond those that they could label with words. Now here is another task in which they were not very good. Pay attention. Okay. Hope you got this. You have to wait a little bit, and you will, if you look at the bottom, it's a bit bizarre that they fall from the bottom of the box, but this is what we could do with PowerPoint. I'll spare you the difficulty that Pierre Picard had in bringing PowerPoint to the jungle and to the place where they live, but you get the idea that here there was a certain number of dots. Another number fell down. You have to compute the subtraction. How many are in the box? Those of you who follow might say there is 1 in the box. That's the correct answer. But here we found that the Munduruku were not very good. They were good when numbers were small enough, but as soon as they exceeded 4 or 5, you can see that their performance collapses. This is the value of the first number. We arranged it so that the answer was always 0, 1, or 2, which they could name. And we also asked them in the second experiment to point to the correct result. But you can see the French subjects do much better. What is happening here is that they are not able to track these exact numbers that we can track with some effort, actually, by maybe very quickly scanning them and counting them. So this is a failure of the ability to extract the exact value of a set, which probably depends on the ability to have acquired symbols for these numbers. Finally, very recently, and this is still data we are accumulating now, we ran with them the number space task. And we asked them in a non-verbal way by presenting them on the computer a line like this with a label with 1 object on the left, and this is 10 objects on the right, just a set of objects on the right. And then we gave them various numbers and asked them to place these numbers at a certain location on the line. And we were quite happy to see that they were not linear. It seems that we would be linear in this task, but whether we present the sets of dots as dot patterns, as series of sounds, when we present them the Munduruku numerals, or even Portuguese numerals, which many of them know a little bit of these Portuguese numerals, it's about all they know in Portuguese for many of them, you can see that there is a curved pattern here, which suggests that they may have a compressive, perhaps logarithmic representation of number. So even though these are adults for many of these subjects, you can see that they have kept, to a certain extent, this representation, which sort of disappears, or at least is hidden by the fact that we acquire exact information from symbols of Arabic digits. I say that this is hidden or masked because I think that we still have such a representation. Although we can think of numbers in linear terms, maybe I can ask you a very simple.
And I'm far out of my field, so I wanted to just ask a few questions from somebody who resides more in the history and philosophy of science, and physics in particular. I begin with just a sense of fascination in the idea of what you might call a kind of bounded a priori. That is to say, the concern that you have, Stan, with trying to understand what is given to us in front of experience in some way, but not to expect that that be the details of some content, but rather a framework within which we reason. And there's a wonderful tradition in philosophy of science and mathematical physics that goes back a ways, into which you've alluded, that goes back to Poincaré and even before to Helmholtz, who are fascinated with the idea of the origins of geometry, but the origins of geometry in a way that would draw on our bodily experiences in some ways, and plus some sense of a prior to experience notion, which for Poincaré, at least in some of his writings, had to do with the group concept in mathematics, and he waffled on how much he believed this, but a sense that there was not an a priori knowledge of the world in knowing specific things about the content of the world, but certain frameworks in which those were realized, and then we picked out that which was convenient by experience with the motor operations that we had, like moving around shapes and being able to put one on top of the other or rotate it, and learning about certain symmetries and relations and the identity and adding up things and discovering that they fit certain structures which seemed to come before experience, although the content was not. And I thought that you've gone much further than these speculations that come in what you might call crudely a neo-Kantian tradition, but it's a rich tradition that offers up a fascination with the roots of mathematics, with geometry, with motor skills, and with the structures in which they fall. Now, you've given that as Poincaré suggests, but you go much further than that, and not just the individual's discovery of certain things or the tradition derived from individuals' discoveries, but also the evolutionary account that ties it down to neurophysiological entities or regions of the brain, and trying to give us, to link the response of individual neurons or clusters of neurons to given stimuli and the kind of recognition of numerosity and other perceptions of the world at least in its approximate form. So I found this in a broad sort of looking out over the last century of work, that there is a fascinating location to these studies within this tradition of what you might call a sort of empirically inflected neo-Kantianism, that is to say, looking at how experience, either individually or over the longer evolutionary time, leads us to select out certain things within larger structures. So I thought that was very, very interesting. I have a couple of questions, and one question is what means fundamental here? That is to say, when you speak about the fundamental concepts of geometry or the fundamental concepts of arithmetic or the foundational concepts of arithmetic or geometry. What does that mean? That is to say, when you speak about, I thought one of the most fascinating lines of reasoning here and in some of the papers that I had the pleasure of reading that you've written, there's a move from, say, the ability to approximate certain numbers, or even to have direct recognition of, say, 2 or 3 objects or 4 objects, but to exact reasoning in a more complex way. And sometimes you refer to this as progressive formalization, sometimes as a movement from the approximate to the exact, but I'm not so sure I understand what that relationship is. That is to say, there seems to be something that is common between the approximate understanding of number and the coincidence in the spatial region of the brain, whether in us or in primates, between of what it means to grasp 3 bananas or 3 bottles of water or whatever it is. But there seems to be something connected about that with our ability to do mathematics in a more exact and abstract way. But I didn't understand what that process was, or even what kind of account we're looking for to connect localized, approximate assessments to these higher level ones. And so my question is, in what sense is it fundamental? That is to say, is it a logically necessary fundamentality? Is it an empirical step that must be passed through in order to get that? What kind of work must be done analytically to go from the approximate to the exact, and more generally, from the fundamental to the higher level? Related to this is, as you know, this very long-standing, ferocious debate among mathematics, and you alluded to it at the beginning of your talk, between different concepts of what mathematics is about. And one sees it, for instance, in this argument between Frege and Russell on the one side, and people like Poincare on the others. That is to say, Frege detested nothing more than what he called the psychologistic. The psychologistic word, when he wants to really be nasty, he talks about John Stuart Mill and counting with pebbles as the foundational notion of how we come to the number concept. And then on the other side, there's this long-standing view about the acquisition of numbers in some sort of quasi-empirical form. And so Frege, when he talks about this, refers to ideas as that which is subjective, empirical, psychologistic, and concepts, which are that which is not, which is deracinated deliberately and happily from the psychologistic. So the concepts are supposed to be that which is objective, and the ideas are that which are permanently subjective and in us, in some sense. So in your talk, you often move, it seems, between the psychological or the evolutionarily rooted psychological and concepts. So it's really just a question about whether this is done as a rejection of this distinction in the Frege-Russell sort of picture of mathematics, or whether there's a relationship between the empirical or empirical based on this bounded a priori and these more abstract higher level concepts of mathematics. So the question number 2 is ideas and concepts, what are their relations in mathematics? And then the last question is this one about education, which seems to me very, very, very interesting, and it really has to do with, you know, how. I mean, I thought it was fascinating that there are certain kind of operations that you suggest, like counting, that actually make a difference in the performance in these tasks, more than naming. I thought that was really interesting because I think that philosophically we often get caught up with naming as being some kind of the most sacred, and using that term very deliberately, of mental operations, and that it's actually the operations that you focus on as being much more efficacious. I thought that's very interesting and potentially very helpful to us in a practical sense. I thought, are there other kinds of operations in the development of the kinds of things you're talking about in geometry, whether are there analogs to counting like rotations or inversions? I mean, are there other sorts of operations that are important in this process? And you mentioned that sometimes our intuitive moves in mathematics can often be destructive in learning. That is to say, we may be all dressed up and ready to go for certain kinds of measurements and so on, but we're dressed all the wrong way to understand negative numbers or imaginary numbers or all sorts of things that are very important in mathematics, but they may pull against what we're prepared to evolutionarily. And I like this insight a lot because it seems to me to get away from a sort of a Panglossian picture that we live in the best of all possible worlds and we've been selected for in just the right way so we can go to town with higher mathematics and physics and everything else. And it seems to me very helpful to remind ourselves, or to have you remind us, that we may be all set up to go the wrong way. Thank you.
Well, these are great questions. So difficult to answer, I think. We know a little bit about the adult state, and I have to say 95% of my work was ever done with adults. But all of the questions you're asking are about the emergence of this system and how it changes. And these are, as the developmentalist here in Harvard know, it's such a difficult question. So you're pointing to all of the difficult aspects of what we don't know, really. I hardly know where to start. Clearly, the transition from approximate to exact involves many different operations, and we are not sure which are the crucial ones. At the same time, children learn different things. They learn the consequence. But we know this is not sufficient, at least initially. We know from the work of Karen Wynne that they can recite the consequence without yet relating the individual words to the appropriate numbers. So that also takes another insight. And in that respect, I think I would slightly disagree with what you said. It's not naming, but it's counting. Well, it's naming and counting and integrating the systems together. And I wish to correct an impression that I might have given that it's just this approximate system and the system of symbols. There is probably a third system, which has been very nicely described by Sukhare here, which is a system of exact small numbers of objects. Object files. It seems that infants have this ability to track small number of objects and track them through their trajectories. And again, this system needs to be integrated with the others. So at this point, I don't think there is any simple answer to what is the trajectory of integration of these different systems. Now, the issue of concepts, which of course is to some extent is the endpoint of this process in the view I'm trying to defend, is even more difficult. I think if there is one problem that cognitive science does not know how to address is the problem of concepts, really. But I would still argue as a materialist community neuroscientist that concepts are physical firings of neurons in your brain, nothing else. So we have to find an explanation in the way they are organized, categorically probably. And I would look with great interest to an interpretation in terms of the brain developing categories where perhaps other animal species remain in a more continuous world. And I will develop this theme in a lecture tomorrow, that maybe we have a frontal system that is especially apt at categorizing and especially developed in humans. So this is about all I have to say. Yes, you mentioned the notion of empiricism, and of course, in a certain sense, what I'm saying is that we derive these foundational objects, what I've called foundational or fundamental objects, from the external world because they are useful for our survival. So in a certain sense, it is a form of empiricism. At the same time, these objects have been there in our brains for a long, long time. We do not acquire them in the course of interacting in the lifetime of the individual. We have them probably very early on and probably with some genetic basis as suggested by these dyscalculia syndromes that can have a genetic basis. So it's a form of qualified empiricism or empiricism based on prior evolution. And I think one name needs to be mentioned in that respect is the name of the great psychologist Roger Shepard, who developed these ideas ahead of anybody else, and especially this idea, he uses the word internalization of external physics. So our brain has internalized in the course of its evolution structures that are quite abstract, that can be described as abstract mathematical spaces. In his case, he developed a whole mathematization of these spaces, and that help us structure our conceptualization of the world. But it's not yet a concept, and what is a concept, I think, will remain a mystery for a long time in cognitive science.
So I'd also like to thank you for certainly stimulating some interesting thoughts. I guess the kinds of questions I have are a little bit different, but somewhat related. I guess fundamentally, this is an issue I think that faces universities, it faces all of us. We sort of tend to distinguish mathematics from sort of other forms of learning. And mathematics, in the sense that something like seeing that there are three objects, I'm not sure I see the difference between that and seeing that it was green. Like, when is it a perception and when is it mathematics? And why? And if you were to study something about general perceptions of the world, I would like to understand better how, when the neural processes overlap with the types of things you were looking at. And so I guess the beginning would be sort of how to categorize things in the first place. When do we call something mathematics versus when is it perception? I think you hinted at that. But, I mean, mathematics, as I understand it, has to do with forming a whole structure about something. And a lot of the observations that were made, a lot of the tests that were done in the Amazon seem to be simply observations. How do we perceive the world? So it's sort of the starting point for mathematics, perhaps. But it's the same way in which sort of knowing the alphabet isn't the same as writing literature. And I can certainly recognize colors, but I'm a terrible artist. So I guess the question is how we really study mathematics and when do we call it mathematics? And even once we decide what is mathematics, within mathematics there are many, well, there are at least several different categories. And I think a big distinction is sort of discrete mathematics versus continuous mathematics. And sort of hinted at how we, get from one to the other by having some geometry which will put a lattice on so that we tend to make things discrete so we can measure them. But ultimately, it seems that there's certainly a big difference in perception, and then there's also a big difference in the mathematical framework that we would use to build upon that. So again, just talking about mathematics as it's one single thing, I'm confused. And is there actually evidence that from the neural system that that the types of perceptions and the types of reasoning that goes into, say, discrete mathematics would really overlap with what we do with geometry? Or can it be as different as reading, which also has some logical structures within it, and doing some forms of discrete mathematics? And I guess the final thing that I would want to ask is in terms of learning and the concepts, because again, when we take mathematics and we abstract it from the real world, we might come to very different conclusions. For example, negative numbers, this was said to me by someone who doesn't do mathematics, but negative numbers are very confusing to people. But owing people money is not a difficult concept for anyone. So, so when do we call it, again, when do we call it mathematics, and how do we integrate that into the way we're learning about things? Is the way we're learning about things is it really just the structure and how it's taught, or is it really that the concepts themselves are difficult? Thank you.
I remember being asked the same question in a much less polite way by a French mathematician. What he said was that what I said had absolutely nothing to do with mathematics. It was really counting pebbles, as was said before. I think the criticism holds that what I'm talking about is really like the minimum amount of mathematics that we can have. It's really not speaking to the high-level mathematics of Ramanujan or yourself. However, I think that it's the case that mathematicians tend to forget their roots a little bit. Because, of course, we have reached such an incredible development of these fields. And mathematics, I don't know exactly when you can say that mathematics started, but mathematics probably started as a process of being able to count properly the objects of the external world and to make computations with the simple counts. So for a long time, mathematicians have forgotten that entire treatises were written to solve a linear equation or to solve a quadratic equation, something that we learn at school very early on and that no respectable mathematician would call mathematics these days. Or we would really say it's the beginning of mathematics. Right? I see you disagree, so maybe you consider that it is already part of mathematics. Yes. Okay.
I mean, you have to go through several stages before you can. So I guess I would call it.
Okay. So I think you and I would agree then that mathematics begins when there is an act of mental integration starting on some foundational intuitions but abstracting from them, something like that. And you ask whether there is therefore a single process of mathematics or whether it's a disparate set of systems. According to the view I'm developing, there is not much evidence, first of all, I have to say. So there is not much evidence for whether a single binary is involved for geometry and number and logic. I think it's very unlikely. And for the moment, what we see is, first of all, a large set of systems. I'm afraid I might have given the impression that a single brain area might be sufficient to do any complex task. It is, of course, not at all the case. I pointed to a single area that may have these number neurons, but even a task as simple as doing a simple addition requires the coordination of multiple areas. And in my view, aspects of mathematics as disparate as geometry and number and logic are very likely to rely on different brain systems evolved for different reasons. But what is particular about the human mind is that we keep searching for better integration of these different systems. And I think that's probably the reason why we think there is a single domain of mathematics, because we've reached a level where we have integrated these different intuitions remarkably. And so, as we all know, we can demonstrate theorems in number domain by moving into abstract geometrical spaces and vice versa. So finally, I come back to your question, what is mathematics? It's an incredibly difficult question, but I think what is particular about mathematics as a science is that you can do it with your eyes closed, without any relation to the external world, purely by manipulating your mental representations. So I think we call something mathematics when it is, in a certain sense, empirical, because we explore the organization of our mental representations, but we don't need to explore them in relation to the external world any longer. Otherwise, we call it physics when we have at least to take some minimal input from the external world. Of course, the boundary will be a little bit fuzzy. It was pointed out again by Roger Shepard that in physics we do mental thought experiments, and it's remarkable that we can do thought experiments. We can get a lot about the external world just by thinking about what would be the outcome of a certain experiment. So, for instance, Galileo, apparently even before doing an experiment on falling bodies, showed by a simple mental experiment, by imagining a chain linking two bodies, that they would have to fall at the same speed regardless of their weight, because otherwise, if you link two spheres together, they make one object, they should fall faster, but it seems absurd. So by thought experiment alone, we can get a lot of information about the external world, and again, it's an indication that we have abstract structures in our brains that are evolved relative to the external world, that have internalized representations of the external world. But in mathematics, we cut the link with the external world, and we begin to work among these representations by themselves, in a certain sense. That would be my answer to what is a very difficult question.
So I take some questions next.
Yes, please.
You were talking about Gaussian tuning curve for perception of numbers. Did you observe that this curve actually tuned during learning?
That's a very excellent question. The work on number neurons is not mine. It's the work of Andreas Nieder and Earl Miller. I don't think they look at the learning process. But we can get indirect information from a psychophysical task that look at the ability to discriminate number, and it seems that in humans, the Weber fraction, the precision of the system, is about twice better than in the monkey. So there is a suggestion that there is an increase in precision, and Elisabeth Spelke and her group have shown that there is a decrease in the Weber fraction even between 6 months and 9 months of age in infants. So presumably throughout our childhood, we get a refined precision of that system. And this may play a role perhaps in the final crystallization of discrete number, but we don't know this.
My second question is, you explain to us where is the physical origin of very simple mathematics which unifies us, adults, mathematicians, with kids, and with native tribal people and with animals. Now, of course, we would like to know how in the mind we got from that to real mathematics. And that will of course answer the question, what is the difference between mathematics and non-mathematics? Clearly, it is some sort of manipulations of symbols, symbolic representations, etc. But do you have a hope in the next near future to really find mechanisms in the mind that are responsible for real mathematics?
I don't know if I can answer this question. We will certainly explore the ability to do sequential calculation. And I think there is a key here which relates to Mark Hauser's idea about recursion as a central ability of the human mind. I suspect that that's the direction where we have to look. So first, how we acquire one symbol. Second, how we combine together multiple symbols. And tomorrow I will point slightly in this direction. I think we have to do research into how the human mind can implement a sort of Turing machine, an ability to follow a specific algorithm and make one object out of a syntactically organized chain of symbols. But we know very, very little about this and how it's done by the human mind. And we know even less or nothing as to how it's done at the level of the neurons themselves. Yeah. Well, maybe we should take another. Al.
So I want to ask a tough question too. So if mathematics is something that is out there platonically to be discovered, you can say that given human variability, some people are going to be better at it than others. You might want to say, I wouldn't, that some groups of people are better at it than others. Now, on the contrary, if mathematics is a psychological capability that has responded to evolutionary pressure, you may come to the conclusion that there are many mathematics. And some people are good at some, and some other people are good at others. And if they're made to do someone else's mathematics, then that is good. Do you think there are many mathematics, or just one?
I think there is one mathematics which we progressively construct, but in the process of constructing, we explore many pathways. But then we converge onto what seems to be the most stable possible solutions. I think we all have the same mental structures to a large extent. We're all born with this number sense, for instance. So even though you may be right that there may be variations in the degree to which we are attracted to one domain or to another, I would suggest that the basic representations are shared by all children. And I think it's a strong message for education also. I strongly believe that it's a matter of the initial trajectory of the child and the tastes of the child and perhaps the taste of his environment that will determine that a given child will be attracted to mathematics or not. But I strongly suspect that it's a diverging process. Initially, the differences are relatively small. For instance, differences between boys and girls have never been found in the first year of life in these baby studies. They are found later on in life, and it's very much debated whether they have anything to do with biology. Most likely there is a huge impact of education, even if there is perhaps a small biological difference. We don't really know this. All we know is that the impact of education is absolutely enormous on these higher level mathematical abilities. Mark?
A general question that then ties to a specific part of the experience. The general question is, how does the human brain / mind know that it's in the number domain? And so what tells it I'm not doing number? So it relates to Lisa's kind of sort of jokey part, which is that we have a hard time with a negative number. We don't have a hard time knowing that we are owed some money. But now if you're owed some money because the number system activates itself, for example. And here's why it's a specific question for an experiment. In the case where you do the habituation method, where you go from numerals to dots, presumably when you go from numerals to dots, it's easy to then sort of get into the number system because you've already triggered it by the error of numerals. And so you go to dots and okay, we're doing number. But if you start with dots, what does it tell you that you're doing anything having to do with number? And how long does the brain take to realize at some level that I'm doing number now, right, as opposed to anything else in the world? So the general question, but the specific question of the experiment is there any asymmetry in the habituation process when you go from the error of numerals to the dots, as opposed to dots to numerals?
So yes, there was an asymmetry. I realize now that I did not quite explain how this might relate to this tuning curve idea. My idea is, I think a different interpretation from yours, is that if you have a very broad tuning curve for dots, you habituate many more neurons that include the more precise neurons that code for Arabic digits. So you have transfer habituation from dots to Arabic digits, but in the converse direction, if you habituate to Arabic digits, you habituate a narrow population of neurons. There are still many others that have not been habituated, so you have little transfer in that direction. Sorry, I missed that part of the talk a little bit. Now your interpretation or your question is a little bit different. It says that number is just one aspect of the world, just like you mentioned color is another perceptual. We can attend or choose not to attend to these dimensions. And the trick probably in these experiments is that we let subjects basically attend to what they like. They are lying in a scanner, and so number is an obvious dimension to which they can attend. But I believe that just like in other perceptual experiments that have been done in fMRI, if we ask subjects confronted with exactly the same set to attend to the shapes or to attend to the color or to attend to the number of objects, we would find that there are strong differences in activation. So again, this idea that we can play with a flexible system in a top-down manner.
I guess this is maybe where imaging is not yet ready to do this kind of experiment. I guess the question would be this. Subjects in a scanner, now dots come up. Presumably when you first see dots, the area that you're going to pick up is not the area that's going to activate initially. The question is, when does that thing become selectively activated? It's not my turn.
I think you underestimate though the automaticity of these systems a little bit. So we can choose to attend, but we know from the monkey experiments that the firing of these number cells is extraordinarily fast. Well, they're heavily trained, and it's true that they make this for a living. So we will have to see if it gets slower and more flexible or more less invariable in less trained monkeys. That has not been done. But I suspect that there is no reason to think that number is much more complicated than color or shape extraction. It's just about as fast, and to some extent automatic, but automatic does not mean that it's not influenced by attention, of course. Yes?
So we started off with this magnitude system that has a logarithmic numerical space, and what gets us from the logarithmic numerical space to a linear one that's embodied in counting, and that's just the basis of natural number arithmetic, is by somehow tuning the curves and making them less noisy. But that doesn't seem logically possible to me. I don't see how you can turn a logarithmic space into a linear one simply by making the distributions around the points more precise. You still have a logarithmic representation. So do you think it might be possible that actually the way you get the linear system is from this other system you mentioned, the object files?
You have to distinguish what the model says and what the story could be in real children. And the model of Vergus and Fias is very, very limited. All it has is inputs that are in a continuous form or that are discrete representations. And that is sufficient to trigger a radical change in the representation, simply because there is just the same amount of difference between 7 and 8 than there is between 1 and 2. So from this you get sharp tuning curves that no longer have this kind of Weber's law associated with them, and so are not well described by a logarithmic representation. Now in real children it could be more complicated than that. There are lots of possible influences that might help children linearize their representation. There is the measurement operation, which I think is very important. We have discovered this is a cultural invention that perhaps the Munduruku have not discovered, that you can measure with number. And once you measure, you better do it in a linear way. At least that's the obvious way to do when you move a unit around. So I suspect that measurement plays an important role. And once again, in the development of children, it's a very complicated matter because there is integration of very different systems all at once, and developmental psychology is only beginning to separate now these different systems. Are there other questions? Yes. Oh.
So this may be a more naive version of the question some of the commenters were asking earlier, but I was a bit baffled by the two hypotheses you said at the beginning, right? That mathematics was either out there and external in some sense, or it was internal and psychological. Because naively, it seems to me it sort of depends on how you're using the word, right? It's just like anything else, like object or tree, right? You could both refer to objects out there in the world, but then certainly we have representations of objects in our head. And a really interesting question is how these come to coincide with the degrees to which they do, either through evolution or through learning. And as you were talking, you seem to be saying that as well. But at the very beginning, you said that you were firmly in favor of the view that it was psychological. So I guess I'm kind of wondering what I'm missing. And I'm wondering whether you see this as being fundamentally different than the question of whether objects or trees are out there in the world or in our heads.
So I think we create mental categories out of a world which can be organized according to many, many different dimensions. I do not think that it is appropriate to say that the external world is mathematically organized. I think we organize it with mathematics. And there would be other ways to organize it. But this becomes a very heavily loaded philosophical statement. You may think that I started with a strawman division initially, but I don't think it's a strawman at all when you look at practicing mathematicians. They really believe that the objects that they explore are out there. They completely believe that whether or not they exist, these objects continue to exist. They strongly believe, and to a certain extent, of course, they are absolutely right, that another mathematician on the other side of the planet would hit upon exactly the same difficulties and so on and so forth. And we have to explain these introspections, but they are very real, and they lead many mathematicians to a form also of mysticism about the outside world, which is interesting. I suspect that there might be something deep, not just construction of ideas, but something deep about the psychology of the mathematician. But now I'm giving you a very wild idea again. But there is a possibility that in order to develop these extremely abstract mathematics with a brain which is of course not designed at all for that in the course of evolution, you have to again recycle a lot of your brain areas for these extremely abstract objects. And I wonder whether mathematicians use even their perceptual areas to create mental percepts for these abstract conceptual spaces. I don't know if you have an introspection of what is being done when you play with an 11-dimensional space, and whether by scanning you we would find that visual areas are active or parietal areas are active or not. But my impression is that this may give the mathematician an impression of solidity, an impression that there is an object that is as rigid as any object in the outside world, and therefore leading to this Platonic attitude, which I think is a little bit of an illusion.
Do you think it's different in space, or the Shepard's story about space that you were telling earlier, where it's something external that gets internalized?
Well, we have internalized some regularities about space, but in this process of internalization, we turn it into simplified objects, which has its own rules, and this becomes the rules of mathematics. I think there would be many different ways to categorize the external world. Again, I think this is a point that was made by Poincaré, that if we were fish, we would have a completely different geometry, because we would be living in a different type of space. I'm not sure if this is the exact citation. Maybe you can correct me. But I think it is true. I think we have absorbed the relevant regularities of the external world at the space, at the scale in which we live in. So the fact that they are movable objects, that we can turn around them. This was Poincaré's intuition, and this led to the group of motion, and this is how we are led to a three-dimensional space. But if we were sensitive to other aspects of the external world, we might have developed completely different intuitions about space.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.